Perspective community members. This webinar is going to be recorded and we will share it out with everybody who is registered. And so if you have friends or fellow coaches or parents who aren't able to attend, you'll be able to share out the recording after the fact. My name is Casey Miller and I'm the Vice President of External Relations for Positive Coaching Alliance. And just a quick blurb about PCA. We are a national nonprofit organization where our mission is to change the culture of youth sports so that every child, regardless of social or economic circumstance, has access to a positive youth sports experience. And we work all across the United States and all 50 states at the grassroots level. And oftentimes our partners will come to PCA and let us know about challenges that they're facing or resources that they are looking for to help build a positive culture. And not surprisingly, we get a lot of requests and questions around athlete mental health at the youth and high school sports space. And so we have established a trusted resource partnership with the JED Foundation to help meet the needs of our grassroots partners, youth sports administrators, high school athletic departments, and are super excited to, as part of this partnership, to kick off with this webinar. I am going to introduce our host for today, who is Courtney Pollock. Courtney Pollock is PCA's Executive Vice President of Education and Product, and she has been with PCA for 16 plus years. Courtney attended Washington and Lee University in Virginia, where she was on the varsity women's soccer team for all 4 years. And she also has coached youth soccer and is a parent of 2 boys. And so Courtney will be leading our conversation with Drew Robinson, Shayna Alexander, and Suzanne Button. And so I will kick it over to Courtney to introduce each of our panelists. And one final note before I sign off is if anybody has questions during the webinar, feel free to use the Q&A feature that's down at the bottom. You should see a Q&A bubble. You can click there, input your questions. We'll be monitoring those. And at the end of the conversation, we will highlight some of those questions. So thank you so much. Courtney, over to you.
Casey, thank you so much. I am so honored to be here today with our guests, who I will introduce now. I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Shayna Alexander. Shayna is in her 3rd year with the San Francisco Giants as the Director of Mental Health and Employee Assistance Programming, where she's responsible for both on and off the field mental health needs and performance enhancements of players and staff. Alexander earned her bachelor's degree from UC Davis and her master's and doctorate at Argosy University in the Bay Area in California. Shayna, thanks so much for being here today. Next up is Dr. Susie Button. She is the Senior Clinical Director of High School Programming for the JED Foundation. JED is a nonprofit that protects emotional health and prevents suicide for our nation's teens and young adults. Over the course of her 20-year career, Susie has expanded her impact by providing consultative services to private schools, public school districts, and treatment service systems for youth, and provided direct clinical care using evidence-based treatment for adults, adolescents, children, and families. Thank you so much for joining. And last but not least, Drew Robinson. Drew is in his 1st full year under the baseball operations side of the San Francisco Giants, assisting Dr. Shayna Alexander in the mental health and wellness department. Born and raised in Las Vegas, Nevada, Drew signed his first professional player contract with the Texas Rangers out of high school and went on to play parts of 12 seasons with the Rangers, Cardinals, and Giants, while spending parts of 3 seasons at the major league level. In February of 2020, Drew and ESPN released an E60 documentary on his survived suicide attempt and eventual comeback to professional baseball after losing his right eye in the incident, in hopes to create awareness and end the stigma around mental health. So I'd like to thank all of you for being here today and for having this important conversation with us, and for everyone for taking time to join us. The intersection of youth sports and mental health. There's a number of different levels we're going to address today. The first is just creating a positive environment for youth to play sports and have that be a positive part of their mental health. The second are challenges and risks associated with youth sports. And finally, how to recognize red flags and how to recognize that there's an issue, and more importantly, what to do about it for parents and coaches joining us today. So Susie, I wonder if we might start with you. And in our previous conversations, we've talked about the role that sports can be as such a positive experience for young people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. We've had lots of conversations. And first, I want to say I'm so appreciative to Drew and to Dr. Alexander for joining me today. The work that you're both doing is so critical to the mental health of student athletes across the country. And as we've talked about, athletics, sports generally, when it's done well, when it meets important developmental and learning goals, it can be very good for the mental health of young people. We know that overall, when young people are involved in athletics, they experience lower levels of stress and depression and anxiety. Their substance misuse risk and other risky behavior levels tend to decline, right? So sports really tends to keep kids out of those trouble areas. And we also know that being involved in athletics overall can really increase youth resilience, right? So it gives young people a sense of agency, mastery, confidence. And interestingly, some recent studies have shown that significant involvement in youth athletics actually elevates levels of empathy for young people. So there are lots and lots of benefits to mental health for being in athletics.
Thank you so much. One of the things I heard you talk about was sports done right can be that positive for young people. Shana, one of the things we talk about is how to react to a person's performance, whether that's good or bad. And when we think about sports done right through a coach or parent lens, I think that's a really important point, the difference between effort and performance. I wonder if you might talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something I've seen across the board from before I worked with the Giants and even now while working with the Giants. I think what's really important is to treat your athlete the same no matter how they perform. So after the game, don't hash out all the different plays and the car ride home. Always be supportive and help them. If they want to talk about it, absolutely go ahead and have that conversation with them. But I think what's important is to have the athlete lead that conversation. You don't want that car ride home to be a miserable car ride home. If they had the best game of their life or the worst game of their life, treat them the same. And really, we want to look at their effort and their own personal goals rather than comparing them to others.
We talk a lot about that at Positive Coaching Alliance, the fact that we have control over our own effort. We can't control anyone else's. So I love that. Drew, you have the unique experience of playing youth sports all the way up to the top level. And I know both you and Shane in our previous conversations talked about parents being an influence at no matter the level. I wonder if you might talk about both the good and the bad that you've seen from the parental perspective in youth sports.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important, like Shannon touched on with especially car ride home. I remember so many times being a younger athlete. My dad was really good. He was very low key, so he didn't add a bunch of pressure on me after the fact, and he was really supportive. But I played with plenty of teammates that wasn't the case, and their parents were just so on top of them. So I think like managing expectations from a parent's perspective of understanding that no matter what you do, no matter what how much you're trying to guide them, perfection will never be the outcome. So like Shannon said, touching on being supportive no matter good or bad, and really just kind of letting them guide the conversation, because after a game, an athlete is so emotionally charged that sometimes it's hard to articulate what they did or what we went through. So I mean, I can speak from experience with trying to pinpoint why something happened after a game during an interview. Sometimes I wasn't able to do it. So letting them kind of take some time to take a deep breath and reflect and just create a space for when they are ready. That's when we can address things and really lead with more open-ended conversations instead of telling them how to do something, do this, do that, because then it just creates an uncomfortable environment, and then probably actually prompt them to not want to have those conversations in the future. So creating a more comfortable space and really just managing expectations when it comes to your kid's performance from a parent's perspective.
Yeah, that concept of creating space, I think we always talk about how youth sports provides an opportunity for youth to practice life lessons and learn life lessons, but what an opportunity for parents to practice skills that they'll use throughout their parenting. So youth sports being that experience for both people. One of the other parts of when we think about youth sports done right is responding to failure and the importance of learning how to fail. Susie, I wonder if you might talk about that as a building block and a parent's role in that situation.
Yeah, it's such an important piece of resilience. I want to say that, I'm a parent of 15-year-old twins, and like all parents, I have really healthy intentions for my teens when they're playing sports. But I recently read a study that said that most parents, when they examine their goals for their young athlete, and then they're asked to examine their behavior both at the field, right, or at the pool deck or in the car, as Drew mentioned on the way home, their actual behaviors don't match their goals for their young person. So we want to take those healthy intentions that parents have, and we want to help parents match their behaviors to their goals. So a big piece of what most parents want for their young person is to grow, develop, feel strong, and be ready for the transition to college and young adulthood. Learning to fail is such an important piece of that transition. One of the things that we know about the building blocks of resilience is that when a young person fails, when something doesn't go well, when they're allowed to learn to manage the emotions that go with that failure, problem solve around that failure, and then move on to the next task, success, game, swim meet, that really helps them develop resilience. So we really want to encourage parents to A, create that space, as everybody on this webinar is saying, to fail. B, ask those contemplative questions that Drew was describing after a perceived failure. Help your young person make sense of it for themselves, manage their emotions, and move on to the next step, as opposed to having to manage your emotions about it. And C, sports is important because it allows young people to connect to caring adults outside their family. So let coaches be coaches and let them coach around the specifics of sports while you're there to really support and scaffold that emotional growth and development.
The matching behaviors to your goals, we often talk about, for both coaches and parents, have someone videotape you on the sidelines and see, when you reflect that back, when you watch that back, like you said, does it match what you intended to do, where you intended to be that day? So I love that, the goal for a parent isn't your child never failing. It's helping, let them figure out how to get past that. Such a critical skill. I want to transition us a little bit here to thinking about, okay, well, we've created, we can all try our best to create this positive environment. There's a role for coaches to play in that. There's a role for parents. There's a role for athletes in supporting their teammates. But there are challenges. There are unique challenges that athletes face, and sports doesn't always go right. One of the things, building off of what Drew said around space and conversation, Shana, you've talked about that the risk is hard to determine and to see, and that conversation in and of itself, continued conversation, is such a critical component. I wonder if you can elaborate on that a little.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most difficult things about being a psychologist is that risk is very unpredictable at times. So we'll think somebody's high risk and we'll do assessments up and down and make sure that they have all the resources that they have. And then out of the blue, somebody who wasn't even on your radar is the one who was really at risk. And I think Drew is a perfect example of this, where if you would have asked any of the coaches or his teammates, no one would have seen this coming. His family members, nobody saw this coming. No one would have predicted any risk with him. And I think that's what's so tricky. And so along those lines, I want everybody to feel comfortable having those difficult conversations with these athletes or their loved ones, not even just when you're concerned, but here and there, just check in. How are you doing? And don't be afraid if somebody is having a tough time or struggling, asking, are you having thoughts of wanting to end your life? And being really specific about those questions, rather than saying, if they make a broad statement like they can't go on or they don't know how to continue on, I really want you to not avoid that, but go into a further discussion about it and get more specific around it so that you can make sure that they're going to get the resources that they need. I think that is, really important. One thing that I had wanted to go back to just really quickly is that last question you asked me about the impact of their parents. Something I had wanted to share is, even at this professional level, which was actually quite surprising, I see these players wanting to please their parents, more specifically their fathers. Oftentimes fathers play a big role in and baseball lives, maybe coaching or whatever it might be. And so your impact really sticks with this athlete for life. And so I really want you to take that to heart. How you respond now and how you treat your athlete at a young age is going to really shape them as an adult. And I always tell parents, there's nothing you can say as they approach that plate right now that's going to be helpful. So just go ahead and have a seat and take a breath, right? So yeah, sorry that I got off track
the
with
truth?
Right?
Yeah.
But going back to the risk question, what I always really encourage everyone, and Drew's doing a great job with this in his role around peer advocacy within the Giants, is helping people have these difficult conversations. So many people, if somebody starts crying or having a tough time, you want to avoid it or say, oh, it's okay, it's going to be okay, or change the topic. Excuse me, don't do that. Really go into it and have a conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Again, I think that so much of this applies across the board for parents. It's the same conversation they say if you're talking with your kid about puberty, have a million of those tiny conversations and not one big conversation, and go right to the topics, So I think this is the type of thing that we can model in any conversation. I want to, I'm building on the events of this past week, which have been quite emotional, and thinking about how I talked with my own kids about the situation and sharing my emotion, and sharing what I was feeling in addition to what, they might be feeling, and how to model the sharing of emotions. Drew, it reminded me, you started talking the other day when we spoke about bragging about your mental health, this concept that you talked about with us. And I think there's some emotion there, which is why I'm bringing us there, to reduce stigma around this topic. Can you say a little bit more about what you meant by that, bragging about your mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just another one of those topics that's just so important. We brag about, not brag, but I think people feel a sense of pride when it comes to every other aspect in their life when they're actively working on it. And the easiest comparison is the physical health of things. I always use the comparison that if you went and told somebody you ran 5 miles this morning, that person and yourself would usually feel a sense of pride. But I still feel like there's a little bit of a hesitation attached when people say that they're addressing their mental health. And I think that's because it's so common that people wait until it is an emergency or a crisis type moment to address it, when really it's something that you can be more of like a very comforting or preventative way, or open-minded or growth way. And then that way it doesn't eventually get to an emotional heart attack. And I think it's so important to change the tone around it, because at the end of the day, it is something that's just bringing the best out of us. So why wouldn't we brag about it, just the same way that when we feel prideful of being really consistent with our workouts or exercise or whatever goal that we have in mind, just being open to like almost bragging about, like, yeah, I went and did therapy this morning and I feel really good about the things we talked about. And now I feel like I can show up in this environment or that environment or in this relationship in a much more like open way, which again, it's the saying of you can't pour from an empty cup. So taking care of yourself only allows you to help take care of other people too. So I just think for me, again, being in the shoes of someone that was kind of reinforcing the stigma before my incident and knowing why and understanding the misconception, I understand it. But also now these last 2 years of really diving into addressing my mental health and seeing some serious benefits from it, it almost makes my skin crawl to think that people aren't willing to brag about addressing their mental health, because again, you are with yourself every second of the day. So why not make it a more enjoyable relationship, which I think addressing these things from emotional and mental well-being standpoint in a preventative way instead of a crisis or emergency way, it's just such a no-brainer. So that's why I'm really confident when I do talk about, I do weekly therapy, I do meditations, like I do say the word love to my guy friends, whoever, and just saying it with a confident tone, I just think is such an important thing, especially when relaying to younger athletes or younger kids and letting them know that is a form of strength and not weakness.
Man, going back to your space comment, I feel like I just want to leave space for what you just said. It's so powerful. I loved the bridging language you used, emotional heart attack, right? People get these physical illnesses or physical things that happen, but that emotional mental health piece is still, that stigma's there. It's hard for people to talk about. So making that that bridge is very powerful. I think what I want to talk about next sort of gets at a lot of the questions that we got from our audience, and that is, how do you know? We talked in the past about the stress path or the growth path, and how do you know if someone you're pushing them in a good way, or are you pushing them in a way that's pushing them too hard, or that's in the danger zone of this is harmful to their mental health. Susie, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this idea of how to assess where someone is, how to assess what path they're on.
Yeah, I love that. I love that conversation about a stress path versus a growth path. And let's start out by saying a stress versus growth is not a black and white distinction, right? That the same young person can be experiencing stress that's beyond their capacity to cope at one point, and then feeling pushed and challenged in a way that's growth supporting at another moment. And so one of the pieces that I think is really important is that we keep that conversation open, which is what Shana and Drew have been saying about what are the young person's goals, where are they at, how are they feeling, and what challenges feel growth inducing to them and what challenges feel overwhelming and stressful to them. And rather than, someone said in the chat, they wanted to know, what do I do when my son gets frustrated with me at saying it's okay? Well, when your child shows that kind of emotion, it's often a sign that they're experiencing some of that stress path, right? So that when you say to them, it's okay, and they're not feeling it's okay, right? That's an indicator that they're experiencing some stress. That's when you want to open that conversation up and say, what's happening for you? What's making you feel angry about what just happened at the game, or that loss or that mistake that your teammate made? You want to try and dig in there. Another distinction between stress path and growth path has to do with whether the goals that a young person is pursuing are internal goals, things that they care about and are passionate about, or imposed goals that the people around them are imposing upon them, right? And so those pieces, right, like what Shana was saying, trying to please your mom or your dad, right? Those pieces are good, but in extreme, when they're obscuring your own growth, your own challenge, your own passion, right, about what you're doing, and taking the fun away, that's when we're talking about edging over to the stress path. So I like to check in with both my patients and the athletes I'm raising. I like to check in frequently. Are you having fun? Is this sport fun for you? What are your goals for the season, right? What are you enjoying, right? I like to check in about how they're feeling about their coach. I like to check in about how they're thinking about progress in sports, right? What do they define as their own development and growth in sports? I like to stay away from outcome imposition, I call it, right? Messaging that I have a skin in the game in terms of their swim times or whether their team loses or wins, and more that my skin is in the game of supporting their goals and their passions and their interests. And that's really how we can really help kids move and stay on the growth path and manage it when it jumps over to stress. And it will, particularly when you get to higher levels of athletics, right? In high school and college, there are going to be times of stress. But by checking in and having those conversations with kids, and also staying away from imposing our own goals and assumptions on them, we can really keep them growing and coping.
Yeah, I mean, the concept that it's not binary, right? You're not either on the stress path or the growth path. And I think if one of the biggest takeaways so far is around that continuous check-in. This isn't something you set at the beginning of the season and then never address again. This isn't something you only do when you see a red flag. It's that continual conversation. I think that's great. When we think about challenges in youth sports, I have to come to growth mindset and fixed mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Susie and Drew, I wonder if for the two of you, Drew, I'm specifically interested in your feedback on this. Like, how do you maintain that growth mindset? How do you not get into that? You talked before about perfectionism, and that's not the end goal. And how do you keep it focused on growth mindset and getting better and not comparing, the comparison trap, all of those types of things?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is this was my biggest challenge as an athlete of trying to be perfect. And it almost came from this desire to be in control of everything outside of me. And it gave me like a false sense of control when I did perceive that I did things perfectly. And when I wasn't doing them, it was, I feel like I need to be perfect, so this is unacceptable. So no, it isn't okay that I make this mistake. And so I've learned that it was this false sense of control that I was always chasing, when really I've learned that it comes back to all the things that I can control within myself, of my effort and how I show up in each situation and what I'm doing to get better. So the idea of growth is something that I've had to learn the hard way, that you don't just achieve it. Like, you don't actually achieve growth where it's like, I've achieved it and I don't have to work at this anymore. It's a continuous effort to always learn from the situation I'm going through, and kind of touching or remind myself of the standard that I place on myself, that instead of it being perfection, it's effort, it's open-mindedness, it's growth, it's learning, it's what can I learn from this tough situation, even though it won't take away the uncomfortable feeling of a perceived failure, but the going into it before that happens with a growth mindset or an open mindset allows me to focus more on the things that I can control, instead of leaving things a chance to when they do go wrong. It seems like it's unacceptable, and my false sense of control comes into play. Like, nope, it's not okay, dad or mom, that I made that error, because I do expect perfection. It's okay, I made that error, so what can I learn from this to help that it doesn't happen as often? Because saying that, how do I make it not happen again, is also not realistic, because unfortunately it is going to happen again. So just having that understanding that you can always grow, but you don't actually achieve it, like where it's not an end thing where you don't actually, you're finished with the work at some point. It's a continuous thing, which in some sense for me, like my old pessimistic self would feel like a little like disheartened by that, like, oh no, I want to achieve that. But now, like, my more optimistic self sees that I can always be better. And it's like, that's the whole goal of athletes and anyone really. Like, there is always room for improvement, not that huge jump in improvement, but those little minuscule habit changes or things to create more consistent growth, instead of this big life altering growth mindset or perfection mindset. It's just that continuous battle on it, which again, for me, I had to learn the hard way.
The concept of the false sense of control feels super powerful to me. People thinking, oh, I'm doing well, I can control this. And then it's that letdown of, wait, maybe I can't. I think that right there, that nuance and that discussion feels really powerful. Shayna, how about you on this same topic? You have athletes at the highest level. Talk about growth mindset and how it plays in here.
Well, it is very challenging, obviously, at the professional level, but I always go back to one of the basics in sports psychology is what you tell yourself really makes a difference. And so to try and be as positive as you can in your self-talk and your thinking is going to be so important. Even if you're having a slump, going through a really tough time, what you tell yourself matters. And I tell them, the more you hear something, the more you're going to believe it and the more you're going to act on it. And that's even your own thoughts. And so something that I'll have some of our athletes do is keep a daily success journal around something that went well or what they feel they have been successful in that day as an athlete, just so that they can highlight more of the positives rather than focusing on the negatives. So you may have an absolutely one of your worst games results wise, but you can still find some positive things that you did as an athlete. And so that's one of the basic things that I talk with all of our athletes about, is that self-talk really matters.
Yeah, that's huge. The success journal. I think I will start that with my with my kids today. I love that, focusing on the little things and getting them to not only see how they can fail and get up again, but what are you actually achieving, right? What are,
Right.
Let yourself see and live in those successes.
And it's so simple. And, sometimes maybe it's too much to ask somebody to write it down. Then I just say, at least think about it. Or for some of you, if you have like a family dinner, make a little bit of time throughout the day at that dinner to say, what went well today? What did you like about yourself today? Something along those lines, so that it shifts that negative thinking. Because oftentimes when we're in a negative space, then some really great stuff will be passing us by but we're really trying to find all the negative stuff that's going to contribute to how we're feeling. So it's a really nice way to kind of pause that negative feeling or those depressive feelings and look outside the box and find something more positive. And it's so simple to do.
So simple. And I think it gets at this question we got from one of our attendees. And Susie, I wonder if you can expand on this. They said, how do I support my child who's doing good, but feels mediocre because they have such high standards? I think what you said seems like it could play a big role there. But Susie, I wonder if you have anything else to add about those high standards.
Yeah, well, I have a lot to say about perfectionism and about a fixed mindset. And so I think it's important to think first and foremost preventatively when you have a young person who you're parenting who's hard on themselves, right? And to think about where your lens goes, where you point the grow light. So make sure that you're using growth mindset language with your young person whenever you're working with them on anything, school, a chore, a sports game, right? Mention the things that you saw that they worked hard on. Mention the effort that you saw. Stay away from mentioning the outcomes, right? And show the grow light on the effort. And then if you have a young person who really has a tendency to beat themselves up, it's okay in those moments, right? To sort of say, I disagree. I disagree with that. I really do see, I value the effort you're making. I value the growth I see in you. And I don't agree that, you know, a B is a bad grade, right? Or right, whatever the athletic or the athlete version is of that. I think what's really important to make an explicit link here between learning to fail and growth mindset, right? That we talked at the beginning about how important it is to learn to fail, but it's not just learning to fail or learning to not be that top level athlete, the best athlete on the team. It's learning what you grow from at every game, every practice, every test, every challenging school assignment, right? That's how you sort of start to counter that perfectionistic thinking.
Yeah, a lot there as well, for sure. There are so many great questions coming in and we have so many different things to discuss. Drew, one of the concepts that you've talked about in our previous conversation is sort of around identity and only identifying as a baseball player. And if baseball isn't going well, can you have separation from the sport? Can you think about other hobbies? I just wonder if you could talk about that concept in general of that people identifying as this, and when they tear their ACL, when they are having that gets really tough.
Yeah, this is again another one of those topics that is so important because it is very easy to fall in the trap of attaching identity to something that you're doing and something outside of yourself again. So I think I've learned that identity is something that, again, can't be taken away from me. So while it's admirable and it doesn't take away the effort and the work and everything that you do towards what you're working on or being the best at what you're doing, I think identity is something that just completely comes from within. So it comes from the way that you carry yourself, the way you show up in a situation, the way you treat people. I think it's something that cannot be taken away from you. And it's so important to really feel that, because even though I was practicing that early on in my recovery process after my incident, sometimes it was hard to actually believe it, because it's like, no, I'm a baseball player. I want to get back to playing baseball, or I want to do this, I want to do that. And I had to really just like dive into it and really start to feel it, because it does feel really good to know that even though like last year when I made my comeback, statistically, I was not doing well as a performer, but I got to experience genuine impact on people's lives in a positive way just by simply being myself, just by treating them with respect, treating myself with respect, being coached, all the things that come with being an athlete. And again, that's something that no one will ever be able to take away from me. So it comes back to this saying that someone might not remember exactly what you say to them, but they'll always remember the way that you made them feel. And it's something, again, I think that's just a tribute to like the way that you show up in a situation, and that's something that can't be taken away from you. So identity is one of those tricky things, because again, not attaching it to being an athlete might seem scary for somebody, because it might seem like that's leading to complacency and not working at your craft, but really you can do both, while again reinforcing that just showing up and being the best version of yourself is all you can ask of yourself. And that's something that no one will ever be able to take away from you.
I'm on mute. I was reading an article recently in the Washington Post where athletes were talking about how, especially at a high level, if they play in college, they're playing this sport, their social circle is smaller, they're a part of this group. When COVID happened, if an injury sidelines them, that again, it's very hard for them to think there's anything outside of that world. What can parents, this is building on what you said, Drew, and Shayna and Susie, I'll open up to you. What can coaches and parents do to make sure that that world isn't so small, so that when the inevitable happens, that their playing days ends, that they get injured, that, you know, that they feel like they have something else?
I'll start and say, you know, we've seen some questions in the chat about that we've lost some high profile college athletes this year. And I know that we all talked when we were getting ready for this webinar about the importance of identity and how the COVID shutdown took away that important sense of identity as an athlete. And for some athletes, it's been difficult to recover from that absence of identity. And so, you know, one of the things to think about is in sports psychology, we know a lot about the psychology of rest, right? That actually, even all the way up to the elite levels, the best athletes will tell you that they've figured out a way to meaningfully rest in between practices and games and meets. And when they say rest, when you really dig into the literature on that, it's actually mental rest, meaning that every athlete who performs well and manages their health and mental health well has found a way to step away from their identity as an athlete and the high stakes that they associate with that and build another set of identities. And those can be as a musician or a writer or a Frisbee player or a gamer or a parent or a good friend or a volunteer. But I think it's really important when we're thinking about prevention of risk for athletes that we think about rest and identity. What are the ways that we can diversify young people's identities and understand that stepping away from driving yourself forward as an athlete is actually going to benefit you as an athlete, and it's going to benefit your mental health or your young person's mental health if you're parenting someone.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Shane, I want to give you a chance to weigh in on this.
Yeah, so I have a personal bias where I always think education is so important. I think it's so important that we put a lot of emphasis on education, that they're a human first and an athlete second. And they need to have their education and prioritize their education so that, you know, if something does go wrong with their health or they don't make it to become a professional athlete, they do have something to fall back on. They have their education, which could never be taken away from them. Their degree is so important. And so personally, I feel really passionate about that and encouraging our players who haven't gotten a degree to consider doing something like that during the off season, to consider furthering their education, to have other interests is so important. And something else that I have heard in my role, which I found really interesting, is they often see that a more well-rounded baseball player specifically didn't just play baseball his whole life or her whole life, a softball player. They played other sports. And so putting just all your eggs in one basket's never helpful. I think having a well-rounded human in general who is fully educated is what's going to be most successful in life. And so a thing that I do with our athletes is anyone who comes to me and wants to work on performance, the very first thing I do is touch on mental health and make sure that everything off the field is okay. I feel really strongly that we need to get at the root of the problem and feel really balanced off the field before we're going to be able to perform well on the field.
That's great. Thank you very much for that. I am seeing many things come into the chat to me about people being sort of terrified about hiding in plain sight. You know, what I want to get into next is what are the signs that someone might be struggling and what can you do? And then I'd like to follow on that with what if there are no signs? Shayna, you talked about that with Drew. You know, people would have never known around him. And I think that's really hard for parents and coaches to hear. And that's the truth. So Susie, maybe we would start with you again on what are some of the signs and what can people do?
Sure. Well, it's important. I know Shane is going to talk about keeping the conversation open, but also keeping eyes and ears open on young people. One of the most important ideas is to look at changes from baseline, right? So, for example, withdrawing from things that a young person used to enjoy, withdrawing from or being grumpy about things that used to seem fun for them, right? Those are really important things. When you hear from peers or teammates that a young person is not engaging in social activity or answering texts or connecting with important friend groups or significant others, that's a sign of struggle, right? And you definitely want to reach out. Changes in appetite, right? Changes in sleep. And that can go both ways, right? And sometimes in athletics, that's hard to catch because there are some sports in which we're actually pushing young people to gain or lose weight, right? So we want families and friends and significant others to be paying attention to eating patterns and sleeping patterns, too much, too little, or just really significant and dramatic changes. And then the other piece to know is often depression can be missed because someone who is depressed doesn't always look like that movie character version of someone who's sad and stunned and passive, but someone who's irritable and angry and frequently more frustrated than they have been at baseline often is struggling with some level of depression. And so when we see these kinds of signs, it becomes even more important to have those difficult conversations that Shane has been talking about.
Part of what I hear you saying is, going back to that question we had earlier around, well, what if my kid seems frustrated when I say mistakes are okay? It's almost like that's not the important thing. It's important that frustration is the piece of information for you there, right? That they may be on the stress path. Forget whether what you said was right or wrong. The fact that you're seeing that emotional response to what you're saying gives you information as a parent, that there may be more there that you need to try to talk with them about.
Yeah, and I want to just say one other thing about that, right? There's a lot of confusion sometimes with middle schoolers, teenagers, and young adults around something we call hot cognition, which we've all seen in our kids, right? And the young people we're coaching or working with. Hot cognition are those moments when a teenager says, I'll never have a success again, or I'm always failing, right? That's a normal developmental piece of the brain that happens between, 12 and 24 now and again, and a little more frequently between 14 and 16. But what we're talking about when we say irritation and frustration is more of a habitual pattern of that kind of irritability or overwhelm that seems more frequent and isn't more regularly interspersed with sort of that reasonable, rational kid that at baseline.
Drew, I want to loop you in on this conversation, and I just want to appreciate you in advance for sharing on this. And people have asked, what could someone have done to have made a difference for you? What could a parent have done? What could a coach have done? So I wonder if you can share about that topic.
Yeah. Again, very passionate about this, but it is interesting because the education part that Dr. Alexander talked about is so important too, because I wasn't aware that irritability and frustration and anger and like almost basically a rage was a sign of depression at times. So one, like creating the education and awareness that is a sign is so important. And then for me, I think just because I was so stubborn and so comfortable or habitually portraying that I was fine, even though I was spiraling inside. And I was so stubborn that it probably would have been really hard if someone were to sit down with me to try to actually crack through to me. And I think for me, that's why I'm so passionate about walking the walk. And I think people in positions of leadership walking the walk, and again, bragging about taking care of these things and addressing these things and letting them know that it is a sense of strength. It is cool. It's fun. It can create a sense of pride, knowing that doing the dirty work or that uncomfortable work at times is important. And I think that, again, sometimes for maybe someone that you're not seeing the signs, just being an example might be the crack through to somebody who might be struggling that someone else might not be aware of. So again, I just think that in a personal sense, because again, I was a very stubborn person And I had no idea that irritability and all these self-talk habits were a sign of depression. And I just didn't have the awareness or the education. And I think I unknowingly was looking up to a lot of people that were doing that work and setting that example. So being that, and then again, creating the space and creating that language of, it's not an emergency. It is just something of caring and empathy. Like, I'm here, I'm doing this because I care about you, and I also do it myself. It just creates a much more comfortable transition to starting that conversation.
I love the topic of modeling. We talk about it a lot at PCA. We talk about it for modeling, controlling your emotions at the referees or umpires. We talk about it in all sorts of scenarios. But the modeling of sharing about your mental health, I think, is a concept that is super powerful for coaches and parents. And I wonder if you have any more that you can go into about that, whether it's a coach or a parent in your life that has done that, and talk a little bit more about how people can do that.
Sorry, you just cut out for a quick second. Can you repeat that?
Oh, sorry. Just if you can talk a little bit more about the modeling that you've seen in your life, coaches or parents, and how they've been able to model that sort of sharing of emotion and their mental health.
Yeah, I think I've noticed, or I mean, even try to implement it in my conversations now as a peer at times. I call it the compliment sandwich, of like starting with a very comforting thing, or maybe even acknowledging something they're good at, and then addressing the thing that needs some work, or talking about something that I need to work on, and then ending it with something of more an empowering tone to it. So I think of just so many coaches that were willing to believe in me and give me guidance. And usually they started with like, hey man, you have so much talent. You have so much, you're such a good person. So, and then let's work on this though. And then ending it with something. So I think, again, the tone, or the approach part of it is so important too, because a lot of times athletes are just so in the act, we're just so emotionally charged that sometimes it's hard to have that rational lens in that moment, because we're so charged that we can't even think straight at times. So having someone in a calming or just a clear-minded way of approaching the athlete and approaching me, I just think starting with something that's empowering or ending with something empowering, again, will bring that sense of remembering the feeling, or that connection, rather than the actual wordage, which again I think is so important, because like I said, I think about so many coaches that I can't give you an exact conversation that happened with. I mean, one of my coaches who was my manager for parts of 7th season in the minor leagues probably can't even give specifics of a conversation that he gave me, if it's some kind of lesson, but I respect the guy so much and love him so much that he was the 4th person I called from the hospital after I eventually woke up from my first surgery, because he had that big of an impact on me. So being that example and being a good person and being an understanding, all those traits is just, it's so impactful and so shaping and so comforting. So again, I think it's just important to walk the walk, just as much as it is to try to say the right thing, because sometimes there isn't an actual fix in the moment. It's really about just guidance and creating that growth.
Thank you so much, Shane. I want to open up to you to comment on this topic.
Yeah, so I actually feel really passionate about this. When I took the job with the Giants, they asked, how can we reduce the stigma and make it a good thing for the guys to come see you, rather than it feel like they're going to the principal's office or they're in trouble or something's wrong, right? And I said it needs to come from above. And they heard that message really loud and clear, and they've acted on it really well. It's been unbelievable, the support we've seen from the management with the Giants around mental health. For example, not this spring training, but last spring training, the manager of our big league team, Gabe Kapler, led the very first meeting of spring training with talking about mental health and his own experience as a player, and how he had wished they had the resources we have now, and some personal stuff that he went through, and how helpful it would have been for him to talk to a psychologist or a therapist or a sports psychologist during that time, and how much he wants us to utilize the services that we have. That is really looked at as a really important resource and nothing negative at all. And so when I reach out to certain guys who are struggling, I'll let them know, listen, this isn't about you struggling or being in a bad space, this is about us wanting to invest in you. This is a really good sign. And so we've really kind of flipped it and made it a positive experience within the Giants. And it makes me so proud to be a part of that organization and a part of that team. So every single spring training, we have a mental health awareness day. And we have shirts made and we talk about mental health. We'll do mental health surveys. And so coming from the coaches, I think it's so important for them to encourage their athletes to get the support they need, to talk about what is a sports psychologist, to ask maybe a sports psychologist to come in and give a presentation. Parents, I think it's important for you to talk about how it's very normal to have a range of emotions. It's okay to be upset. It's okay to be emotional at times. And if you're going through it, go ahead and have a cry in front of them and let them know, sometimes we all get sad and it's tough. And never be afraid, if you're worried about something, to get a professional involved. That's something I feel really strongly about. If there's any concerns here, consult with a professional, have your athlete meet with them. There's no harm in that in any way.
I think the two things I'm walking away with is specifically about, what to do what do we do about the situation that people are hiding in plain sight? I think, Drew, you're back to your comment around creating space, creating an environment where people just feel open to share, can really help in that situation. And then your comment on, you might think, oh, the person who's depressed knows they're depressed. That might feel obvious. That is so, I love that educating everybody on those various signs themselves can help them to self-identify in that way. I think that's really powerful. I know we're getting near our time here, but there are a couple of key questions that I want to for sure hit on. One, which we could have a whole nother hour-long discussion on, is social media and the intersection of mental health and sports and social media. Drew, in our call previously last week about this webinar, you talked about scrolling and you talked about some key questions to ask athletes. I wonder if you'd share on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so, again, it comes back to like self-awareness or education or just being present to know what is actually happening in the moment, and understanding what you're looking at is you are feeding yourself that info or that image or those sayings or whatever. So being conscious of what you're looking at on social media, and then also like having actual conversations with yourself again, which creates awareness and intention, I guess. So I just think it can so easily go both ways, where it can be a very empowering or very healthy environment, or it can go the opposite way of not being the most beneficial environment. So social media was created for really good reasons, but again, I think it's gotten a little out of hand at times. And I think some people just mindlessly scroll so much. And another thing that I go back to when it comes to social media a lot is like your conscious mind is always eavesdropping on your subconscious mind. So even if you don't feel like you're actually reading it or actually like interacting with it as much, or it's not that big of a deal, if you're constantly fueling yourself with that, then it's inevitable for me to me, it's inevitable to think that will like come out in your views on the world or views on topics later on. So just being really mindful of what you're actually feeding yourself when it comes to those things, and asking yourself at times, is this serving me, or am I just using this as a distraction, and creating, again, more articulation and more awareness within yourself of why you're actually doing that. And it's something, again, it's not easy to do. I find myself doing it all the time. So having different techniques to bring this to my awareness, and then again, starting that conversation within myself, it's only going to create a more beneficial or more healthy interaction or environment.
Yeah, expanding our definition of nutrition to not just be what you put in your mouth, but what you consume for your mind as well. That concept is great. There are so many here to answer. I wish we could go on. I think where I want to go next, and this is a little bit nuanced here of conversation that we've already hit on, but there's a lot coming in about this. How do you help athletes who want to strive for their best, who are driven, while assuring them that their value isn't in their performance? There's comments coming in on the same topic around, from a small town, and, they don't want to let their community down, but, just having the community members share with these people that their value isn't how they perform. Shanna, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I talk to our guys quite a lot about this. And one little simple exercise that I'll do is say, what if we brought, 5 guys from the clubhouse in here and asked, what type of person you are, despite how you perform? What would they say about you? And so giving perspective of others, I think, is so important for them to recognize that there's so much more than just a baseball player. There's so much more to them. Maybe they're a father, they're a son, or whatever it might be. And having other interests, once again, I think is so important. And so that is a little skill that I'll use that can be helpful for them.
I like this topic too because it's, I think a lot of us, and well, I can't say that, but for myself, like staying away from the idea of it, such extremism, where it's like, if I'm not at that Mamba mentality of being the best, of working insanely hard all the time, then I'm being complacent, which isn't the case. It's more that ebb and flow or that rhythm of like going and tapping into that Mamba mentality, and then also taking time to recharge when it's needed, and like step back and take a deep breath. And it's the ebb and flow of competition is so important because, or with that mindset, because like I said, if you're not naturally Kobe Bryant and you're trying to be him, then that's just going to get really exhausting, and it's going to be that burnout. It's just asking to be a burnout later on, because that's not naturally who you are. So I think it's more important because most of us it'd be more beneficial to tap into more of that, like that harmony of balancing those two ends of the spectrum, because really it's like no one's going to be balanced at all times, but we can tap in at times to when sport gets really hard and you have to show that grit through that adversity. But also there's times where it's appropriate to kind of step back and take a deep breath. You like, and I said the term ebb and flow. It's so applicable to everything, because like, I mean, when you're working out, what do you do before you try to lift a really heavy weight? You take a deep breath, and then you hold it and you push out while you're breathing. And then to do the next rep, you have to take a deep breath. So like that really acute example, but it's so easy to fall in the trap of, if I'm not doing everything at 100% or working as hard as I possibly can, then I'm being complacent, which isn't the case. If you think of it from a percentage aspect, it's like, if I can be 90%, 100%, 100% of the time, it's going to lead to way more success than if you're trying to be 100% of the time one day, and then you burn out, so you have to go back to 0%. So I just think that extreme mentality of, if I'm doing one thing one way, that's how I'm always going to do it, just isn't beneficial. It's not sustainable. So knowing when it's appropriate to be your tough self or be your grindy self, and then also when you can take a step back to try to take those 10 steps forward even faster.
I love you have to take a deep breath before you push the weight. I love that. Susie, I'm going to give you one last quick question here before I have to wrap it up. And that is, what is one thing that coaches, teachers, and parents can do today to start supporting the mental health of young athletes?
We can all take collective responsibility for shining our attention on the qualities and activities that young people exhibit and do that are not athletic outcomes.
I love it. Well, I know that I can. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, just really quickly. One last thing that I feel so passionate about that I wanted to leave everybody with is, when people are struggling, having a really tough time, I want them to know that there is treatment out there to feel better. This is not how you're going to feel the rest of your life. And I think that's where we get into trouble with risk, is when people feel like they're stuck and this is never going to change. And I don't want to live a life like this where I'm feeling this way all the time. There's treatment out there. There is help out there.
Yeah, that is also very powerful. Drew, what one last piece of advice do you have for the people here today?
Yeah, Shayna, she spurred this. It's two quotes that I say to myself 20 times a day, or just throughout my week so often, but everything's temporary, good or bad, or good and bad. So when we are in that moment of loneliness or hopelessness, like Shayna said, having that awareness that even though this is really uncomfortable and I feel like I'm in this, I'm in my pit, it is temporary. And again, it's not going to make the feeling go away. It's still going to be uncomfortable, but hopefully it creates that little bit of trust or faith in the back of your mind that it's not always going to be this way. The good is right around the corner. And then it also helps to really absorb the good when it's going, because it is temporary. Everything's temporary. So when things are going well, then you know that it is temporary, and it forces a sense of even deeper appreciation and gratitude for that good. So when things are going bad, it's temporary. And then also, in a more extreme quote, more attached to what I attempted, is for someone that might be in the same shoes as I was, is someone would always rather hear from you than hear about you. That quote just always hits me so hard, because I think if that would have been told to me before, I would have looked at what I was getting ready to decide on much different. My family, friends, whoever is around you, even if it's a stranger, they would rather hear from you than hear about you. So yeah, like I said, those two quotes, and everything's temporary. I just think it's so important that there is a lot of help out there. There's a lot of good people out there that would be willing to help. Like Shana said, there's treatments. I'm a prime example of it. I've completely dedicated my life to this last 2 years, and I've seen serious benefits from addressing this side of my life.
Well, we are grateful to each of you for having joined this conversation. The work that you are dedicating your lives to. Positive Coaching Alliance is proud to partner with the Giants and with the JED Foundation. So thank you so much for your partnership in this conversation. The webinar was recorded today, and each person who has registered will receive the recap. And we encourage those who have joined to share this resource with your communities. There were many questions we couldn't get to today, and we will be following up with those. We're going to put some more information in the chat right now on key websites and resources that you can visit. We encourage you to follow Drew on social media listed here, and follow his journey. We thank you so much for joining, and any specific feedback or questions, feel free to email pca@positivecoach.org, which again is in the chat right here. We've also listed several key resources around the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and the Crisis Text Line, if you know someone in need. So again, we're grateful so much for your conversation, for your partnership, and for what you do in the communities, and we will see you soon.